Today's reading is Ruth chapter 2. Now Naomi had a relative on her husband's side, a man of standing from the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favour." Naomi said to her, "Go ahead, my daughter." So she went out, entered a field, and began to glean behind the harvesters. As it turned out, she was working in a field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech. Just then Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters. "The Lord be with you." "The Lord bless you," they answered. Boaz asked the overseer of his harvesters, "Who does that young woman belong to?" The overseer replied, "She is the Moabite, who came back from Moab with Naomi. She said, 'Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the harvesters.' She came into the field and has remained here from morning till now, except for a short rest in the shelter." So Boaz said to Ruth, "My daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with the women who work for me. Watch the field where the men are harvesting and follow along after the women. I've told the men not to lay a hand on you, and whenever you are thirsty, go and get a drink from the water jars the men have filled." At this, she bowed down with her face to the ground and asked him, "Why have I found favour in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner?" Boaz replied, "I've been told all about what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother and your homeland and came to live with the people you did not know before. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." "May I continue to find favour in your eyes, my lord," she said. "You have put me at ease by speaking kindly to your servant, though I do not have the standing of one of your servants." At mealtime, Boaz said to her, "Come over here, have some bread and dip it in the wine vinegar." When she sat down with the harvesters, he offered her some roasted grain. She ate all she wanted and had some left over. As she got up to glean, Boaz gave orders to his men, "Let her gather among the sheaves and don't reprimand her. Even pull out some stalks for her from the bundles and leave them for her to pick up, and don't rebuke her." So Ruth gleaned in the field until evening. Then she threshed the barley she'd gathered, and it amounted to about an ephah. She carried it back to town, and her mother-in-law Naomi saw how much she had gathered. Ruth also brought out and gave her what she had left over after she'd eaten enough at the meal. Her mother-in-law asked her, "Where did you glean today? Where did you work? Blessed is the man who took notice of you." Then Ruth told her mother-in-law about the one at whose place she'd been working. "The name of the man I worked with today is Boaz," she said. "The Lord bless him," Naomi said to her daughter-in-law. "He has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead." She added, "That man is our close relative. He's one of our guardian redeemers." Then Ruth the Moabite said, "He even said to me, 'Stay with my workers until they finish harvesting all my grain.'" Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, "It will be good for you, my daughter, to go with the women who work for him, because in someone else's field you might be harmed." So Ruth stayed close to the women of Boaz to glean until the barley and wheat harvests were finished, and she lived with her mother-in-law. Just a reminder that we are in the second week of 4 looking at the book of Ruth as part of the Bible month process. But I want to begin with a story about Joy and myself moving to Cornwall in 1992. When we got there, we initially rented a holiday cottage, but as the season got closer, we had to leave it. And there was no sign of anywhere else for us to live. We were almost strangers in a strange land. Then a preacher from the chapel we'd started worshipping in offered to give us his house while he moved back in with his parents. It's an act of grace we've never forgotten. What could have been a really difficult situation for us, with 2 primary aged children as well, was redeemed by an act of hospitality. And we were in that house for some weeks before we bought our own. Well, in the story of Ruth, we left Naomi and Ruth at their own transition point, arriving in Bethlehem but still feeling like outsiders from Moab. They'd only gone back to Naomi's home because she'd heard that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them. Moab, of course, was in the middle of famine. The 2 women arrived in hope of a better future, but initially there was no evidence that was going to work out. God's blessing didn't seem to be coming their way. None of the extended family stepped in to support them, and Ruth had to go out and glean in the fields. Enter Boaz. Let's look at the 2 central characters, Ruth and Boaz. Boaz was related to Naomi on her husband's side and is described in the Bible text as a man of some standing. Literally, the Hebrew says, a mighty man of power, a worthy man, known and respected with some influence in the community. Naomi and Ruth have come to Bethlehem with nothing, no wealth, no status, and no immediate access to the community around them. Boaz has everything they don't have. The only option is gleaning. Why is that an option? Well, because as the Israelites prepared to move into the promised land, they were given instructions for living a godly life. The story is told for us in Deuteronomy 24, and part of the text says this: when you're harvesting in your field and you overlook a sheaf, do not go back to get it. Leave it for the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow, so that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt. That's why I command you to do this. Ruth, therefore, seeks out a means of survival designated for the destitute. And in some countries, the law still embeds the right of gleaning as a provision for the poorest. Ruth begins to work in Boaz's portion of the field. And we understand from the overseer's words that she's seen simply as a Moabite who's come back to Moab, from Moab with Naomi. She's a foreigner entitled to not much more than the legal provision of a place to glean. Boaz's view is different. He calls her my daughter. In fact, in the next chapter, he tells her the whole town knows her as a woman of noble character. For me, it's impossible to look at this story today and not ask, who are the outsiders in our eyes? Who is it that, if you like, we consider to be from Moab, when of course we are from Bethlehem? How do we respond to those who have some legal entitlement but no real welcome? How do we welcome those who come to this country in search of a better life? How do we, as Christians, respond to the Black Lives Matter question? I saw an image this week of Jesus preaching on the Beatitudes. As he tells the crowd, "Blessed are the poor," someone calls back, "Surely blessed are everybody." And I guess that goes to the root of the debate about Black Lives Matter. Of course every life matters. But the issue in front of us is the historic and continuing whitewashing, and I use that word deliberately, of part of our communities. It's why I'm so pleased that our Secretary of Conference, the Reverend Jonathan Hustler, has put out a statement in the last couple of days reminding us that Methodism believes racism is a denial of the gospel. However, he says, we have to recognise that we've not eradicated the problem from our church, despite the excellent work of many over several decades. In the last year, we've redoubled our efforts to do so and are actively working on the implementation of an inclusive Methodist Church strategy, which commits to challenging all forms of discrimination and creating a church where people from every background are welcome and are safe from abuse and discrimination. You can read more about that on the church's website. But it's timely because in our story of Ruth, the actions of Boaz remind us that we need to find a new generation to be Boaz among us, welcoming, affirming, and embracing. Our son Andrew's dissertation for his sports degree almost 10 years ago was on why there were so few black and minority ethnic managers in football. That hasn't changed in a decade. Following last Sunday's retirement of the Archbishop of York, the Church of England now has no black diocesan bishops. And given the statement from Jonathan Hustler, Methodism is not that much better in our provision of district chairs from black and ethnic minority backgrounds. The Bible is full of charges to God's people to welcome the stranger, to care for those on the margins and not to discriminate. As somebody said this week, there's not a single white person in the Bible. But much of our art assumes that Christ is white. It's why I've always valued the Christ We Share resource produced some years ago with images from around the world. In the story we're looking at today, Boaz stands for everyone who enables the outsider to be welcome. In his eyes, Ruth the Moabite, the foreigner, becomes my daughter. But that's because he's taken time to learn her story. In verse 11 of our text, he says this, "I've been told all about what you've done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband. How you left your father and mother and your homeland and came to live with a people you did not know before. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." Let's remind ourselves what all you have done for your mother-in-law means. Marian highlighted last week Ruth's commitment to Naomi. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die. And there I will be buried. Boaz responds to that commitment and completes the welcome by ordering that she be respected while working, can drink from the communal water jar, and by inviting her to share lunch. Catherine Doob-Sackenfeld, who writes the interpretation commentary series version of Ruth, says this, "The story from start to finish illustrates the ways in which loyal action, kindness and good will produce a surplus that can both break down dividing walls of hostility and open new horizons to shattered lives." Does this sort out Naomi and Ruth's long-term problem? Well, no. A day's gleaning would feed them for a few days. Harvest would last less than 2 months. Then what? There's still more to come, but this is a good news moment. Naomi pronounces her blessing on Boaz, who has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead. That word for kindness is hesed, which is regularly used in Scripture for God's mercy and loving kindness. That's a remarkable contrast to the way Naomi felt when they arrived in Bethlehem. "Don't call me Naomi," she said. "Call me Mara," Hebrew for bitter, because the Almighty has made my life bitter. The story seems to be changing. Ruth, yes, is from Moab. Boaz is from Bethlehem. But Bethlehem, as Marian reminded us last week, means the house of bread. It is here in the point of the story where Naomi and Ruth move from starvation in Moab to the offer of life-saving nourishment in Bethlehem. Boaz, by his hesed, his loving kindness, brings them into a community and recognises his responsibility to protect and provide. And the story's not over yet. There are 2 more chapters to go. But perhaps a good place to leave this week is another quote from Catherine Sackenfield. She says this: "Care and concern for others, at times even going beyond the bounds of usual human responsibility, leads in the providence of God to greater wholeness." That's something of our story over the past few years. We've heard it over and over again, exploring God's call to us as his people. Radical welcome and hospitality. Treating the outsider as an insider. Mirroring God's welcome and his love to all people. That's not a bad recipe for being Boaz in our day. Amen.